So there is this cartel-like tendency among peers. That's what we argue for. That is, so there is kind of this pressure to conform from the peer side. However, the pressure to conform from the peer side is not uniform for all artists.
Hello and welcome to the Delp podcast, where we bring you insights from cutting-edge management research. Today we're talking about creativity and who gets rewarded for it. By default, you might think creativity is automatically rewarded with reputational acclaim and lucrative sales, but according to a recent study, this might not always be the case. Mitali Banerjee is an assistant professor of strategy and organization here at McGill. She used machine learning to quantify creativity in paintings and how it affected the success of artists. She joins us to talk about her findings and what they could mean for organizations and beyond. My name is Saku Mantere and I will be your host today. So today I'm talking to Mitali Banerjee, my colleague here in the strategy and organization area. And Mitali is a really interesting scholar. So she's studying creative artists and she's using machine learning to do this, which is going to be a focus of a really interesting conversation. Mitali did her PhD at Columbia University and then continued at the HEC Paris Business School and has just joined us here at McGill. So Mitali, welcome to the Dell podcast.
Thank you, Saku. It's a pleasure being here.
So let's talk about your project. You published a paper in the Academy of Management Journal where you trained machine learning to analyze paintings. Modern, paintings done by modern artists. So, how do you do something like that?
All of this, much of this deep learning methods have existed. The math behind it, the stats behind it has existed for a long time. What changed in the early 2000s was just the computational power. And what I am doing there is, so at least in the paper, in the AMJ paper, we are not doing any pre-training there. We take an existingly already trained architecture, that is the AlexNet convolutional net architecture. It has been trained over 1 million images, and it's been shown to be very powerful at representing something complex like visual output, very close to how the human eye perceives these visual output. In fact, it's kind of the basis for a lot of new technology in image recognition down to self-driving cars. Not AlexNet per se, but variants and refinements of AlexNet. So that's what we are using. And what that sort of algorithm does is basically take an input of an image. Every image, like any rich data, is basically a set of vectors. An image is a vector of RGB values, red, green, blue values. It's just a vector.
So basically, if you stick your nose very close to an old TV screen, you see these little cells.
The pixels.
The pixels,
values.
Basically.
Exactly.
So, basically it is the pixel values, that have a specific color each.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's what
that's the input.
Yeah, that's what the program looks at. So how does it pick up distinctiveness of an artwork?
So it is trying to first break it down into smaller geometrical structures, lines, circles, then trying to combine lines and circles. For instance, if you take a line and you take a semicircle, that's the letter 9, for instance, or if it's the horizon, it can be the sunset. And it's basically trying to look at these big, smaller features and bring them together and trying to sort of reconstitute the image from ground up. Once we have that vector representation, we compute the cosine distance. Mm-hmm. And that cosine distance is our operationalization of distinctiveness. Okay,
so in your paper you talk about distinctiveness being rewarded in different ways. And you look at a network where there's supply and there's demand. Mm-hmm. Supply in this case, if it's painting, that's the other artists that are within that broad genre. And then there are galleries that offer opportunities for exposing work. Mm-hmm. And it seems that the supply side and the demand side, they reward distinctiveness in a different way. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So that was one of the big aspects of the paper is the peers have very different values and incentives. As we argue in the paper with my co-authors Paul Ingram and Ben Cole, is that the peers have a desire to kind of act as a cartel. They kind of exert a pressure to conformity to themselves. They want others to kind of be like them.
So there's like artistic movements, for instance, artistic movements are born and sort of people do similar things.
Yes, partly because they are kind of gravitate to it from their own preferences. But there is also, to the extent that peers have an influence in the outcomes, career outcomes for you, they are going to more likely to reward others, at least we argue, and find evidence for other artists who are kind of similar to them or doing things similar to them, because that kind of valorizes, legitimizes, gives more power to whatever they are doing. So there is this cartel-like tendency among peers. That's what we argue for. That is, so there is kind of this pressure to conform from the peer side. However, the pressure to conform from the peer side is not uniform for all artists. It matters where you are, where do you stand in this peer network. Do you occupy, are you a very high status actor or low status actor or middle status actor?
Okay.
And generally, so the idea of middle status conformity is people who are at the higher status or the lower status don't really experience that pressure. People at the lower status have very little to lose.
Yeah.
People at the high end are hard to sanction.
Okay.
It's the middle status conformity theory partly says that it's peers, people who are at the middle are going to experience, they have more to lose and they are going to benefit more from conforming.
Okay. So if you're either well respected by your peers, or if you have, little respect from your peers, or perhaps little recognition from your peers, you don't experience the pressure to conform as much as if you're in the middle.
Yes.
Okay, so let's play a little game. Let's generalize this from the world of modern art to, let's say, innovation more generally, that you're an entrepreneur operating in a particular industry. Would you say that this might apply to being a well-respected entrepreneur, or entrepreneur that has very little recognition, or an entrepreneur that's kind of in the middle in terms of status, in their capacity to bring out products that are radically different?
I would think so. That's what I would argue, that there are similarities between artists and entrepreneurs, in the extent that what they are producing often, first of all, requires the support of other peers. It's also uncertain. The value of artwork is uncertain. There's a lot of uncertainty. The value of a new startup is uncertain. And I would argue that, yes, to the extent that you're at the very top of a very well-established entrepreneur, you don't nearly, you can't sanction that person well. They have already established networks with VCs and other investors, possibly customers and suppliers. The ability of peers to sanction such an entrepreneur is kind of limited.
Okay.
And likewise, if you're on the lower end of it, you're on the lower end of it. You're a newcomer. No one really knows you. No one, in some sense, if you deviate people, in some sense, you're very little to lose.
So you should, maybe we could turn this into a little piece of wisdom that if you're an underdog, you should appreciate your ability to innovate.
Absolutely. So I think I loved that result, because usually the idea is if you're an underdog, you're the outsider, you don't really have an opportunity. You may come up with creative products, you may deviate, you may be original, but you're not going to get rewarded. But here we are what we are finding is, yes, you do have that room to deviate, much more so than somebody who's kind of a middle status. But the question is who you're deviating from. In this case, you don't have that. You don't need to be conforming to what your peers are doing. You can be original and actually be better off than the middle status.
Okay, so then your results about the demand side, the galleries in this case, they're slightly different. Actually, I'm reminded by this old adage that somebody who's a famous artist might be a victim of their own fame. And it actually seems that that might not quite be the case, that sort of high status artists are actually rewarded from deviating from their own previous output.
Yes. So that we found that interesting, that one would think that there's a limit to which you can deviate from yourself. The market demands consistency. But the idea behind consistency, or the argument we are making, is that market demands consistency partly because that's kind of what's become your identity. And also on the demand side, if you're going all over the place, there's a question of commitment. Are you able to really do too many different things very well? Are you really committed to what you're doing? However, if you're really very well established on the demand side, you're kind of exhibiting, in this case, artists' work at the top galleries and doing a lot of it, there is very little sort of doubt about your commitment. And that's what we find, for instance, in our data, that such artists have more leeway to deviate from their own work. However, what we do find is that they don't have that much leeway to deviate from their competitors, people who are on the high end of the demand side of the market. Sorry.
So that's super interesting. So, you are in a certain sense then a victim of your own fame, because it seems kind of hard that you have to renew yourself, but you can't really deviate from your competitors. So that's actually not a very pleasant place to be.
So I think being at the top is not, there are constraints. That's what this is suggesting, that being at the top brings with it limitations, and you don't have infinite autonomy to do whatever you want, partly because you constitute, by very being at the top, you are kind of constituting the field, the industry. And to the extent that people on the demand side want to have already invested in creating the market for that field or whatever else you represent, they are going to penalize you if you try to sort of break too far away.
I'm reminded of a question that I sometimes get from executives. They come to a business school professor and ask, how can I help my company become more innovative? And actually quite often, they talk about creativity in the organization, that it seems that our competitors are just more creative in how they're approaching things. And how could I help my company be more creative? And my answer typically is that you should focus on thinking about all the things that you do to kill off creativity in your company. Because I'm reminded what you said about how hard it is to be creative, because you're being different. And typically creative people, they are not well liked by their peers or their managers because they don't conform.
I would say that you can be rewarded for being different. You have to be what sort of concretely is it matters who you're kind of differentiating yourself from. What sort of the implicit ideal paper, which hopefully we'll get a chance at some point to tell you more about, is it's also kind of allowing you to leverage at this point a lot of computational ability to by defining this implicit ideal, we are basically giving creative producers an algorithm to create work that will come close to this ideal, which gives you recognition. So now that we have a vector representation of that ideal, you have lots of generative AI technology. You can feed that vector representation into and reverse engineer what's creative, albeit not by trying to create replicas necessarily, but you can come close to creating within your own preferences and the market you're trying to serve work that will come close to the ideal, the center, the zeitgeist of the moment. So I feel like that paper, by being able to quantify that ideal, is actually might be providing a very agentic way and a very concrete strategy of what kind of creative product should you create. And here is all this generative AI capabilities. You can use it to create work that comes close to whatever ideal that you think you want to come close to. So I feel like that's a pretty agentic view of creativity. It also has implications of what creative production will look like when everybody starts using this, as they are increasingly. But that's a separate question.
Yeah, I guess there could be a lot to be discussed around the role of AI in artistic production in the future and all of these horizons that open. But maybe those are topics for our next discussion.
Yes. One thing I would like to add is, as much as I've been dismayed by how hard it is to be different, I've also come to really appreciate that the actual substance of the work you produce can matter. And can matter in a very powerful way, even when you're an outsider.
So it helps if you're good.
It helps if you're what you're doing. And I think you're often, like, as you said, like, it's very dismaying. Like, if you're different, it doesn't matter. And there's been this I'm a social structuralist, that your social structure determines your fate in many ways. It binds you. But to the extent that we are actually able to look at the work itself with this method, which is kind of stripped away from a lot of social influence, and we show that under circumstances, that work is actually getting rewarded. You're getting exhibition opportunities, you're getting attention. That's kind of powerful. I felt that definitely made me feel more empowered, and also kind of revised like the whole that social structure can have in just reproducing what's come before.
Wow, well that's a pretty profound insight to complete this conversation. Mitali Banerjee, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Saku, very much. It was a pleasure.
And so that's today's episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and you never miss another episode. If you want to learn more about Mitali's work, links to her research are now in the show notes for this episode. Delve is a thought leadership platform for the Desautels Faculty of Management of McGill University. The episode was mixed by Eric DeCare, and I, yours truly, made the original music.